And we're going to go to questions and start with the gentlewoman from the Virgin Islands, Ms. Christensen.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I know the hour is late. I'm not going to have a zillion questions. But I want to start with Mr. Miller. And first of all, let me say that, no one supports, I don't support, and I know you don't support unnecessary or duplicative tests. That being said, though, I really appreciate, as a physician, your defense of physicians in your testimony and your defense of the diagnostic technologies. As you said, and I had made note of this before you said it, I think we have forgotten how far we have come from the days when you had to undergo anesthesia, one risk, laparotomy, another risk, to make these diagnoses. But my question, you said that your experience is really in HIT. Is that correct? Did I read that in your testimony?
I have actually experience in both
okay.
diagnostic imaging, HIT, as
sure.
well as therapies.
Sure. But I wanted to ask about HIT. I think you were very clear in your defense of the technologies. We've been told by many that the projected savings from HIT are grossly exaggerated, and I wondered if, based on your long-time experience in HIT, if you had any thoughts on whether that was the case or whether we would be realizing the savings that we think we are.
The answer to the question is, unfortunately, it depends. If we simply say that what we will do is digitize all information for all patients at all times and think that will lead to productivity, I think we're misguided. I don't know about you. When I get an email with a huge attachment to it, I still print it out. And I used to run one of the largest healthcare information technology businesses in the world. The fact of the matter is, just like pharmaceuticals, to get efficiency out of healthcare information technology, you need the right information about the right patient in the right context of care, going to the right provider at the right time. It's a lot different than just a big file full of data. If a patient is coming to me with severe chest pain, I don't want to know about the mole that was removed last week as the first thing I see in the file. I want to know whether they're taking medication. I want to know what contraindications for medications I may be given. This requires a little more intelligence. So I think the potential is there. We certainly have customers who have realized a lot of potential, but the devil's in the details. And an inexpensive HIT system which simply takes all data, logs it, and makes it available will not change productivity. Productivity rhymes with activity, not with information.
Thank you. Ms. Bhutto, we applauded J&J's wellness and prevention programs, and also the recent proposal by pharma to cut the cost of medication during the donut hole by 50%. We also appreciate your support for elimination of health disparities in the community health centers that you stated in your testimony. We do have a point of departure on the public plan, which the Tri-Caucus is fully supporting, and which I think this committee is bending over backwards to ensure that it does not undermine our market-based system. But I wanted to ask about the CER issue. I've joined with other members in legislation that goes so far as defining the committee that will oversee it and ensuring that the membership on that committee is representative of all of the stakeholders. Important to the Tri-Caucus as well, we directed that research must be done in women and racial and ethnic minorities so that we'll really have the best science for everyone. And further, we direct that the outcome of that research would only be used to provide clinical guidance. Does this address some of the concerns that you raised, or are there others that remain?
No, it sounds like your approach really does address many of the concerns I've raised, and I think the other issue that once you dig below the surface on minorities and women and other subpopulations is as we get closer to personalized medicine.
Yes.
I think we are beginning to realize we need a different approach to doing the clinical trials that actually helps us sort so that we can provide and be more targeted in the treatments we develop. And we're trying to figure out how to do that in a way that gets those targeted treatments that, again, will be better value for money in the system, but also will get to subpopulations, minorities, women, and others who will benefit. And we're still sorting through that, but I think that's part of the equation as well. And it sounds like your approach would allow for that kind of research to go on.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Congressman Deal for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Mr. Kelly, you're familiar, I think, with H.R. 3700 from last Congress that was introduced by Chairman Pallone. I believe you have generally been supportive of the language that was in that piece of legislation. What's missing from this draft that was in the bill Chairman Pallone introduced last year, 3700?
There are some differences. Excuse me. There are some differences. We certainly appreciate that the committee in its draft bill has recognized the importance of this issue and included improvements to the existing law in the bill. We also appreciate your leadership over the years in trying to be helpful on this issue as well. As I understand it, H.R. 3700 defined AMP in a way that reflected pharmacies' acquisition costs, which is our top priority and really central to this debate. The committee's draft currently does not include that, and that's an important priority of ours, and we look forward to continuing to talk to the committee about that. That's reflected in our written statement. That's one of the major issues.
You mentioned that states should consider both components of reimbursement when determining what they're going to pay pharmacists for. What are those two components, and would you explain why it's important to consider both components?
Certainly. Thank you. Historically, pharmacies have been paid for the drug product itself and for dispensing the product. So reimbursement here and then a dispensing fee here. In Medicaid, the states on average reimburse a pharmacy $4.40 to dispense the product. All the evidence indicates that it costs a pharmacy about $10.50 to actually dispense a prescription drug when you consider all the overhead that's involved with running a modern pharmacy today. So it's important to make sure that reimbursement for the drug product is right, which is why getting the AMP definition is so important when it comes to Medicaid product reimbursement, which the federal government has sole jurisdiction over. The states control the dispensing fees in the Medicaid program. And I tell you, this committee in Congress could really help us quite a bit with CMS on this issue of dispensing fees. When DRA was passed, there was a ton of legislative history which indicated the expectation was and the encouragement was that states would allow for increased dispensing fees for pharmacies. Well, about a half a dozen states have submitted state plan amendments requesting just that, and CMS has shot down every single one of them. In fact, just this week, the state of Washington submitted a state plan amendment that would have increased fees by a nickel, and CMS shot it down. So to the extent folks on the committee can be helpful in that regard with CMS, we'd sure appreciate it.
So the two components, one is controlled at the federal level, that being the payment for the drug itself, which is the AMP issue that you alluded to. And you don't think this draft addresses that issue as clearly as the Pallone legislation did. And then the second component being the dispensing fee, which is a state issue by and large, is still left that way under this draft legislation. Is that correct?
There's nothing in this draft that we've seen that indicates any policy changes on dispensing fee. And you're right, there's product reimbursement, and that relates directly to how you define AMP and how you reimburse and calculate the AMP.
Okay. I believe when we were dealing with the MMA, we tried to make sure that seniors had a pharmacy that was going to be close enough and accessible enough for them to handle their pharmacy needs. I don't think there's any language of a similar nature in this draft. Did you find anything that would address that issue? And if not, is that something we should be concerned about?
We've not seen that in this draft, and that you're right, that is a part of the Medicare drug benefit. They actually use the TRICARE healthcare program access standards for community pharmacies, access to community pharmacies. Look, seniors want access to pharmacies. You know, most citizens want access to pharmacies. They want it to be convenient. That's very important. As I said in my testimony, there's a pharmacy within a couple miles of everybody on average in the country. You know, I'm not sure how those access standards would fit into the context of this bill. It made sense for the drug benefit when you were creating that, but I'm just not sure at this moment whether it would fit into the context of this particular bill. It came out very recently, as you know, and we're still kind of combing through it, quite honestly, to get a sense for that.
Thank you.
Congresswoman Jakowski for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to start with Mr. Vaughn, and I welcome you. And I don't know if I've seen you in this role before, but I know that you've been on the Hill for a long time, too. In your written testimony, you identified as a cost-saver legislation that I introduced with Representative Berry, H.R. 684, the Medicare Prescription Drug Savings and Choice Act, which allows Medicare to negotiate for lower drug prices. I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about how that would reduce costs.
Yes, and thank you for that co-sponsorship. And it would probably be, you know, we got good competition in generics and stuff. This would be a place where in a biologic that came in at one of those very, very, very high prices, if the Secretary could work with it a little bit, bring the price down. And I know it works. I happened to work for chairman of the Ways and Means Health Subcommittee in 1989 when the first big blockbuster biologic came in, EPO for folks on kidney disease. And as I recall, the company wanted a launch price, and the chairman was saying, whoa, you know, we're the monopoly buyer. Everybody in the kidney program is in Medicare, and you got a monopoly company. Let's negotiate. The then Secretary didn't particularly want to do that, and it took a lot of press releases and screaming and hollering and threats of hearings and stuff. But I do really believe that jawboning by just one, not just, by a subcommittee chairman on the Hill pushed the Secretary enough that we got that price down $3, $4 a unit. We should have gotten it down 8 or 9, you know, if the Secretary had been a little more gung-ho on it. But that company recovered its entire investment in that drug in 9 months and is making over $1 billion a year in profit from Medicare from that drug now. And we didn't do a very good job negotiating, but we saved billions.
So we don't have to imagine it. Yes, Ms. Buda.
It can work.
Bill, I have to kind of disagree with your memory on this. I was at HICFA at the time. I actually did negotiate that price, and it was done way before the chairman got involved because the company came to us saying, this is an ESRD drug. ESRD is a Medicare population. And I decided I couldn't do this alone. So I got the Inspector General's office and the Office of Management and Budget to sit down with us. And we went through SEC filings. This was a company with one drug and one drug in the pipeline. And we did the best we could around the table to do that. I think you all came along, and I think rightfully so, said, you know, can't we maybe take another $1 off? You did that legislatively.
So you can fight that out later. But the point is,
my point is
that it worked.
No, my point was this: in spite of the fact that it was one company with one drug, we had a very difficult time actually doing the negotiation. That was actually my point.
It is difficult, but you did get some money out of it. And I stand correct. Congratulations for you for having started it all.
It wasn't about money. Can I just make the point? It was about making sure that ESRD beneficiaries had it at the moment that FDA approved it. We wanted to make sure, because there was no other market, that there wasn't a huge delay before they could get access, and that was the reason we needed to set a rate. Because otherwise, Medicare waits for a year or so, and the rates are set in the marketplace, right?
Yes. Well,
It's about access.
It's about access, but I think if we institutionalize this notion of Medicare being a negotiator with the huge network that it represents, that we can do better than we do right. You don't agree with that?
I do agree.
Well, don't insurance companies regularly negotiate for their
They do.
subscribers?
They do, and they set formularies. And my experience with Medicare is that it's been reluctant, shall we say, to set formulary restrictions on what Medicare will cover, because the notion is that, and we always had this underlying our coverage policy, is that the beneficiary population is very diverse and usually fairly chronically ill. And so to exclude certain things just to get price down.
Well, in our bill, in the bill actually that we're talking about, we do set a formulary in the draft for the public option, right? Oh, in my bill, we actually talk about a formulary so that we can negotiate. I guess my time is up.
Out of time, thank you. Congressman Pitts.
Thank you, Mr.
5
Chairman.
minutes.
Thank you, panel, for your wonderful testimony. Mr. Miller, you said that a large part of imaging is done without any association to the financial self-interest of the ordering physician. You also said that the increases in use of imaging are perhaps too often attributed to a financial incentive in ordering the test. Do you believe that one possible reason for the rise in imaging could be the practice of defensive medicine? Do physicians order tests to protect themselves from potential medical liability?
I can only speculate that that could be the case in some cases. I can also state that when we speak to our customers and ask them, because it's important when we design machines, we ask them, why do you order tests? What are you trying to look for? What are you trying to discover? The great majority of time, they're really telling us, we want to be able to see this disease process. We're having difficulty because we don't know if the patient has X versus Y. Now, in knowing if a patient has X versus Y before they treat, if that's defensive, then I can only agree with you. It's probably also good medicine.
MedPAC has given us clear indication that it feels there's a tremendous overuse of medical imaging and that we should rein in the use and reimbursement of such use. Do you feel that there is overuse, and what do you feel is the appropriate way to get at that issue?
I don't think that there is overuse by and large. Are there cases of overuse that might crop up in some place or another? Yeah, probably. However, as I stated in my testimony, what we really believe and support as an industry is appropriateness criteria. I do believe that we should have guidelines which are physician-created and physician-administered that guide people to say, for this type of symptoms, this test is appropriate. For patients with this background of illnesses, this test is appropriate. Doing so may have, however, two consequences. There are times when a test won't be ordered because it's inappropriate. There are other times, and we see this just as often, that a patient will be subjected to a slowly increasing series of tests. They'll come in with chronic headaches, and then something's been going on for a long time, and an X-ray of the head will be ordered. An X-ray of the head will show you the skull. Not many headaches are caused by skull. So sometimes it could lead to actually an increase in the type of imaging that's ordered, a temporary increase in costs. But our argument has been, and what I tried to put forward, is that knowing the patient's condition precisely, characterizing the disease in detail before you start to treat, is probably the best way to save cost in healthcare, because there's nothing more expensive, more wasteful, or more unethical than treating a patient with the wrong treatment for their disease, or even worse, starting a treatment for a disease they don't have.
No, I have just a couple of questions on the DRA. You mentioned in your testimony the large reductions that the DRA imposed on medical imaging, and that during the first year of implementation, that growth in imaging was reduced to only 1.9%. What do you think the reasons were for growth in previous years, and do you feel that the DRA was the only factor in this slowing of the growth, and what was the impact of the DRA and the dissemination of new updated technologies to patients? What would be the impact on future cuts to advanced imaging technology such as CT, MRI, PET, nuclear imaging? Do you think this would, what impact?
Well, we have an advantage that we do business in about 180 countries of the world. So we can look at use patterns not only in the United States, but in many other countries, and see trends and see changes. The DRA had a sudden drop in imaging growth, which we didn't see in any other country at the same time. So in other words, it must have been the DRA. We didn't see it happen in Canada, we didn't see it happen in China, we didn't see it happen in South Africa, any country in Europe, et cetera. DRA happened, growth was reduced. In other countries where there has been no DRA and no financial linkage that would cause overuse, we have seen medical imaging increase year over year in almost every other market we're in. It's increasing in China, it's increasing in Australia, it's increasing in Germany. It's increasing everywhere because, as I said, we are substituting more expensive physical and invasive tests, which things that are non-invasive, more comfortable for the patient, and frankly, looked at as a whole is cheaper. I think the DRA did cause, in some parts of the country, some of our customers to frankly go out of business. I don't think that it resulted in a sea change in care, but we start to get at the limit. And therefore, what I would argue is, in some ways, I hate to phrase it this way, we gave once at the office. We took a large cut in our industry, and we are now at the point where more reimbursement cuts to the suppliers of a service will definitely cause a reduction in access.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Mr. Green?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The chair got back. Otherwise, I was going to recognize myself for 2 hours to ask questions, because I know we were all having so much fun today. But I appreciate it, Mr. Chairman. Let me first ask Mr. Miller, you mentioned in your testimony a large reduction the Deficit Reduction Act imposed on medical imaging, and that during the first year of implementation, that growth in imaging was reduced by only 1.9%. What do you think the reasons were for the growth in previous years, and do you feel like that the DRA was the only factor in slowing that growth?
The growth was starting to slow somewhat in previous years. There were years in which the growth was faster. It started to slow even before the DRA. But the DRA was a quantum step change in the growth of imaging. As I've stated before, I believe the growth in imaging has simply to do with its utility. One of the best examples I can give is that we will probably see a growth in the use of computer tomography in the management of chest pain. That's going to grow. And it's going to grow, and frankly, if it were my family members or me, I'd want it to grow. Because right now, the standard of care in many places for chest pain is you either sit for a long time to get blood tests. The blood tests determine whether your myocardium is dying, or you get put in a cath lab for a very invasive exam. A CT scan for chest pain has an almost 100% negative predictive rate. In other words, if it doesn't show you have disease, you can go home. You are therefore avoiding two things: You're avoiding either sitting around the ED, or if it's late at night, getting checked into the hospital, or you're avoiding a $10,000 catheterization. Forget about the ethical issues. And I believe if people have informed me correctly, you have some experience with this.
I do, and I have to admit, I joked a few years ago that I got belt and suspenders when I was diagnosed for having a heart problem, and it turned out I did the catheter, and then they said, well, why don't we see if we can do the scan? And I sat there and watched it, and I felt like I was getting lobbied with a hospital gown on, and paying for it at the same time. But I appreciate that, because I know in this bill we're concerned about that. I just don't want, and I don't think members want to cut off some of the newer technologies we can get that are less invasive and that actually can be cheaper than, for example, a catheter.
I think that the point I want to make, I can best make by one also very personal experience. My father, 18 months ago, my dad had a stroke. Amazingly, I was in the neighborhood when it happened. I showed up at the emergency room when he had it. The emergency room was outfitted with a state-of-the-art CT scanner from us. And they were able to rule out hemorrhage. He was a candidate for a clot-busting drug. When he came to the ED, he could barely speak. Part of his face was paralyzed. After the drug, some hours later, he now speaks perfectly with his grandchildren. Now, I would ask you, was that expensive? Yes. But what would be the cost of the rehabilitative care over the rest of his life had that not been available? The real issue in looking at these costs is we must look longitudinally over the entire, not only episode of care, but the entire sequence of care.
Okay. Let me go on, because I have time. Ms. Bhutto, I've been working on a piece of legislation, H.R. 1392, which removes the prompt pay discount to extended to wholesalers from the average sales price of Medicare Part B drugs. Most of these drugs are oncology therapies, including chemotherapy, and are administered in physicians' offices or in outpatient settings. As you know, many oncology practices have been reimbursed for these Part B drugs at 2% under the price they purchase the drugs because of the prompt payment discount. One point of opposition to the bill is that some believe the passage of this legislation and the removal of the prompt pay discount will result in higher costs to the government if manufacturers raise drug prices, because the physicians will be reimbursed at the proper rate of the drugs. I believe the price increase in the Part B drug market are largely a function of the level of competition for these drugs rather than a result of the terms included or excluded from the methodology. Would you agree with that? And do you believe that the removal of the prompt pay discount will directly result in drug manufacturers raising their prices?
I do agree with your position, and the prompt pay discount is really a factor in the average sales price that recognizes the cost of doing business. So we really don't think it's a legitimate factor that should go into the average sales price. I agree with you as well that it's the competition among the different drugs in a class that are going to drive the average sales price, not removal or adding of this factor to the ASP.
Okay. Mr. Green, as you can see, the electronic timing devices have ceased to exist.
I promise not to take my 2 hours, Mr. Chair.
You're almost at a minute over, and from now on, I'm going to have to tell you manually what the time is.
Oh, can I just get one more question?
Sure, go ahead.
Again, Ms. Bhutto is a strong supporter of H.R. 1548, the pathway to biosimilars, that's sponsored by Representative Eshoo, Inslee, and Barton, and I. Your testimony, I saw your testimony in support of the bill as well. I'm particularly concerned with the patient safety, and this bill allows for clinical trials and the approval of biosimilars. Could you elaborate for the committee on why clinical trials for biosimilars are an important part of the approval process for biosimilars? And I believe it's important to allow innovator companies to have adequate time to make a return on their investment. There's no incentive for these innovator companies to develop these life-saving treatments if you don't allow that. Can you discuss the data exclusivity provision of H.R. 1548?
Quickly, please.
Very quickly, and I can just say I'm not an expert on this, but I will tell you that our clinical experts are available to the committee, and one of them was an official in the biologics division at the FDA, But briefly, the reason clinicals are so important is that biologics are generally protein-based compounds, and they are not chemicals, so they can't easily be, in fact, they cannot be replicated. And that's why the clinical studies are so important. Our own experiences, even when we changed the bottle stopper on our biologic, it created a immunogenicity problem that created some real adverse effects. So you can make a small change. If you're not careful in doing the studies, you won't know between the innovator and the biosimilar. So it's important.
Thank you. Now from now on, I'm going to have to, oh, it's back up. All right, here we go. Great. All right, next is Mr. Shadegg.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I trust I'll get the same indulgence. Mr. Miller, I want to begin with you. I have my own experience. I had bypass surgery I think 7 years ago now, and I am a huge fan of the work that you and Ms. Butow do. I think it is vitally important that we fund that kind of research and that we fund both the development of drugs, cutting-edge drugs, and of cutting-edge biologics. I believe I heard you, Mr. Miller, say that you like a physician to manage your health care. Is that what you said?
Yes, that is.
And I take it you would agree with me that some of us who have concerns that physicians won't be able to manage health care if we have government-controlled, single-payer, whatever you want to call it, health care, at least if it put a bureaucrat between you and your physician, you'd be concerned about that, would you not?
I would be more than concerned.
Okay, great. I believe at one point you said that something would cause access to plummet, and especially in rural areas. I take it that is any limitation on technology or on the availability of analytic devices such as the type you are advocating, imaging?
Here's the point I was trying to make. In many of rural areas, if the reimbursement rates were driven by a formula that insisted on a 95%, which is not in this draft, but a 95% utilization rate, there will be rural medical imaging centers that will just go out of business. I mean, we know this, we can calculate it, they'll go out of business. Now, you might say, well, that's okay, they can just drive a little further to a hospital, get imaged there. Hospitals these days have capital constraints. They're not ordering extra capacity because they can't afford it. And even worse than that, I mean, populations are getting older. The imaging exams are being dominated not by the technology, but getting the person into the room, calm down, on the table, comfortable with the exam, and getting back off. There's a limitation to what you can do. And frankly, one last point, the high-tech stuff supports some low-tech stuff.
I think your point...
Mammography, for example, gets supported by some high-tech stuff. That will also go away.
I think your point is exactly right on, that imaging has, in fact, in the long run, brought down the cost of health care, and I think restraints placed on imaging have been a mistake. You said that you support, and your company supports, comparative effectiveness research so long as it's looked at in the entire, I think you said, longitude of care. I would agree with that, but my concern is if that longitude of care is looked at by a government bureaucrat, only looking at dollars and cents, as opposed to a physician or a group of physicians looking at both cost and benefit, I'm deeply concerned that comparative effectiveness research could quite frankly put the government in the position of devastating both drug development or pharmaceutical development and device development. If somebody is sitting in there kind of second-guessing you guys, I don't know how it doesn't restrain your capital.
We have the same fear. We have the fear that if it's not done right, it can simply be a way to restrain technology development, which would be horrible for the United States. We are a net exporter of healthcare technology. That would be a huge mistake. However, we look at all technologies we develop and ask ourselves a single question. Does it change the care of the patient in cost, quality, and time? All three factors must be simultaneously considered, and if so, comparative effectiveness research can be a good thing. If not, as you imply, and in the way in which you imply it, I would be dead set against it.
Ms. Butow, I believe you testified very similarly. I believe in very carefully selected language you said, in the hands of physicians, in the hands of people using it for valuable purposes, comparative effectiveness research can be very good, but that if it is in fact used to ration care, as it perhaps has been done in other countries, that would not be good. Am I correct?
You're correct. We've had the experience where treatments for which there's no alternative have been denied based on the application of a cost-effectiveness threshold that most people would admit is kind of arbitrarily set. So I do think it's valuable. I think in this country people will use it, physicians will use it, and patients will use it. So I have no doubt that it will, the value proposition will enter in, but at the right level rather than being set at a national level by a national entity.
You also expressed concern about government negotiation of drug prices. Do you fear that if we get a single-payer system or if we get a public plan that has the power of the government behind that?
Yeah, I was reading the discussion draft, and there was government negotiation within the public plan section. That has great concern for us. As I say, I think our concern really comes from the cascade of a public plan dominating, and then a public plan really becoming more commodity-based in its approach, trying to squeeze down costs by setting prices. That will definitely inhibit innovation. And again, we think this country's been a leader in innovation, and we want to maintain that leadership as well as our, the strong position in the economy that these biologic and pharmaceutical and device companies play in making our economy strong. So there are a lot of reasons, but the real fear is that you have a cascading effect that results in really a commoditization and lack of incentive for the research to go on to develop new treatments.
I want to thank all of the witnesses for their testimony. I want to thank the chair for his indulgence. And I just want to conclude by saying, for me, the single greatest fear I have of either a public plan, which would compete with and I believe ultimately undermine and destroy private health care insurance, or a single-payer insurance, is that it will end innovation. And I mean, right now, we have clinical effectiveness research done by the government. If you put forward either a pharmaceutical saying it will reduce John Shattuck's blood pressure, or a device that will perform a prostate cancer operation on him, you got to prove that it's clinically effective. And I'm all in favor of doctors or insurance companies being able to use comparative effectiveness to look at the cost effectiveness of my care. I want somebody to say, look, Congressman, this drug will be financially much better for you than that drug. But putting comparative effectiveness authority in the hands of a bureaucrat whose job it is to meet numbers criteria rather than to assure, first and foremost, patients' care, I believe is very dangerous. And I believe for the world, I mean, it seems to me, I happened to just drive down here from New Jersey yesterday and past Johnson & Johnson's headquarters, and I know that that is a central part of the economy of New Jersey, and I just pray that we don't do something that will drive capital away from the cutting-edge research that we have, because I'm sitting here alive today because of the work you all have done, and I'd like America to stay out in front, and I fear that under any publicly government-run program, we are going to inhibit that capital, and we're not going to have the kind of cutting-edge medicine that you get when free markets invest and explore for those drugs or those biologics.
Thank you. The gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Space.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I'd like to thank the witnesses for their indulgence. I know it's been a very long day, and I may be the last member to question you. I'm sure you're happy to hear that. I come from Ohio's 18th Congressional District. It's a very rural district. It is, for the most part, within Appalachian proper. And one of the things that we suffer from is a lack of access. Mr. Kelly, I want to thank you for referencing my bill in your testimony, which I've had a chance to review. This bill is designed to exempt those pharmacists who have in good faith practice without fraud or abuse from the surety bond requirements imposed by the last administration as a part of the Medicare DME system. And in our district, I've got one county that has one pharmacist in the entire county. We have a significantly higher than average incidence of diabetes, and the diabetes we do have is not being properly managed. Many of the people that I represent don't have the insurance to purchase test strips, for example, which is a very critical component of the management process for those who suffer from diabetes, type 1 diabetes in particular. And I'm interested in your thoughts on H.R. 1970 that we dropped concerning the exemption of those pharmacists as to how it will affect those pharmacies that are really serving as the primary interface with much of the health consumption community, as well as how it may affect the ability of people who are either uninsured or have policies that don't provide significant coverage in their abilities to purchase things like test strips or other DMEs.
Certainly. Thank you, Mr. Space. And as to your bill, H.R. 1970, we fully endorse it and support it and appreciate your introducing it. You know, the cost of chronic care has been chronicled a lot in this debate on healthcare reform, and it's very important to get a handle on chronic care. Only 50% of the folks with chronic conditions take their medications as they are prescribed, and that's a problem. The people who can help them with that are pharmacists in communities like yours and across the country, in every community, low income and upper income across the country. As it relates specifically to these new requirements, the surety bond requirement that the last administration imposed, CMS actually projected, I should say, that 25,000 DME suppliers would probably drop out of the program as a result of this new surety bond requirement. And this surety bond would apply to each and every pharmacy in a chain of pharmacies. And that's a big deal, not just to members of mine who have 6,000 pharmacies across the country, but half of our members have 20 or fewer stores in their chain. So we have a lot of small business people operating pharmacies across the country. That's going to be a huge expense and a huge hassle to them to obtain a surety bond just to continue to provide diabetes testing supplies and testing strips and glucose monitors to diabetic patients. In Medicare, seniors overwhelmingly obtain their diabetes testing supplies from their local neighborhood pharmacies. And they're going in there to get their insulin already.
Right, and many of these DMEs, glucose monitors and test strips, for example, are over-the-counter products. These are not prescriptive products, correct?
That's absolutely right. The patient is able to walk in and obtain that equipment from the local pharmacist. Our concern, as you've articulated, is that this new requirement and others would really hassle pharmacies out of this program, and that destroys continuity of care. And we're talking a lot in the healthcare reform debate about the importance of continuity of care. It's especially true with chronic conditions like diabetes. If a patient can't get their diabetes testing equipment at the same place where they're already getting their insulin, it doesn't make a lot of sense to us. And you're going to break that bond that's so important right now for good care.
Thank you, Mr. Kelly, and I yield back the balance of my time, all 12 seconds.
Thank you, Mr. Space. Unfortunately for the panel, I still have questions to ask. Hopefully I'll be the last one unless someone else shows up. I wanted to start with, I wanted to ask Ms. Butow a question, then I wanted to ask Mr. Miller. I'll try to get both of these in the 5 minutes or so. Ms. Butow, the President reported 2 days ago that the White House had reached a deal with pharmaceutical manufacturers to cut costs for seniors with incomes up to $85,000 in the donut hole by 50% for brand-name drugs. AARP CEO Barry Rand, along with Senators Baucus and Dodd and representatives of the pharmaceutical community, were involved in reaching the deal. We agree with the importance of rectifying this major flaw in the prescription drug bill that left seniors with no coverage between $2,700 and $4,350. And the discussion draft fills about $500 of this cost immediately and then phases out the donut hole for all Medicare beneficiaries over time. And the discussion draft reinstates the ability of the federal government to get the best price for prescription drugs for the most vulnerable low-income Medicare beneficiaries. Those savings are used to fill the donut hole for all Medicare beneficiaries. Now, my question is, and I asked AARP the same question yesterday, can you clarify for me, do you see this proposed provision in the draft as working together with the commitment by the pharmaceutical manufacturers, thereby filling the donut hole for seniors, or do you view your agreement with the White House in lieu of that discussion draft provision?
First, let me just clarify something and make
Sure.
sure that I have your question correct. We feel that the 50% discount will provide immediate relief, obviously. A provision that we like in the discussion draft is closing the donut hole over time. A provision that we don't like is applying Medicaid rebates to Medicare. So I don't know if that answered your question, but I want to be really clear that we do think that closing the donut hole over time and in the immediate term being able to provide these 50% discounts will help a lot in making that more possible. We're hoping it will reduce the cost for the committee of getting to that closure. But we don't support the transfer of Medicaid rebates to Medicare.
Okay. Well, then I understand where you're coming from. I just wanted to make sure because, of course, AARP said that they would like to see us go all the way in the way that the discussion draft proposes, and obviously I agree with the discussion draft. I just wanted to get your opinion on that. Let me get to Mr. Miller, and I'm going back to the point that Mr. Shadegg touched on about the comparative effectiveness research, in the context of health reform effort. The discussion draft would create a permanent center for comparative effective research, and the purpose of the center is to support research to determine, and I quote, the manner in which diseases, disorders, and other health conditions can most effectively and appropriately be prevented, diagnosed, treated, and managed clinically. In my opinion, it's simply about arming doctors with the best info possible to help them make decisions with their patients. It says nothing about insurance or cost effectiveness. In fact, the draft would prohibit the center from mandating coverage policies. But even with all that, we get the attacks from that this research somehow is going to ration care or reduce access to new technology. So I have two questions. Do you believe that thoughtful, methodologically appropriate comparative effectiveness research focused on patient outcomes will help or hurt patients? And secondly, Siemens, I know, is on the cutting edge of medical imaging technology because it's basically a revolutionary company. Won't this research simply validate the quality of your products?
In both my written and oral testimony, I said I'm for comparative effectiveness research,
right,
with the caveat. And the caveat was that it looks longitudinally across care, and it looks to validate which technologies result in ultimately, as I mentioned before, the lowest cost, the lowest time, and the best quality for the entire episode of patient care. We engage in comparative effectiveness research all the time in the company. We'll have people come to us and say, and every year we have budget time, and our engineers all want to spend all of the money on everything. And we're big, but we still have limited budgets like everyone does. So we have to decide, do we invest in this new MR, do we invest in this new CT or this new ultrasound or this new thing that no one's ever thought of yet? To do this, we engage in our own form of comparative effectiveness research. Maybe done more or less well, but these are exactly the same kind of questions that we actually ask when we decide where we invest our innovation dollars. So therefore, we can't be against it in truth. And plus, if all of the statements I made in both written and oral testimony are true, if I truly believe them, I have nothing to fear. In fact, what should happen, if I'm right, is that you'll end up spending more money on my technology because it improves patient outcomes. So I support it. It must be done the right way. The devil's in the details, but the concept is absolutely supportable.
All right. That's what I wanted to find out, and I appreciate it. And I think that...
Mr. Chairman, if I could just add just
one
other point to what Mr. Miller said. I think
you're not going to fight with me like
no. I'm not going to fight with you. I think the other thing to talk a little bit about is the fact that I think the appropriate comparisons are really across, in dealing with a condition, across the different modalities. One might be a device, one might be a drug, one might be watchful waiting. So I think people tend to think drug to drug, device to device. And the other thing that's recently come in is that geographic variation and the costs are actually being driven by variation around process of care. So more visits, more testing around a treatment can make a big difference. So I think, you know, as the committee considers this, just the complexity of the issues and going beyond just the notion of a drug to drug, device to device, to get that bigger picture of what comparisons we're really after.
Yeah, I understand, and that certainly makes sense to me. I think we're done with the questions and done with the whole hearing. But really, thank you again, because I think, again, your panel as well as the others are very helpful in terms of what we're trying to achieve here with healthcare reform. So we certainly appreciate it. You may get written questions within the next 10 days. We'd ask you to respond to them and get back to us as quickly as possible. Now, again, as yesterday, the committee is going to recess, the subcommittee, I should say, is going to recess and reconvene tomorrow morning at 9:30 to continue our review of the discussion draft. So the committee stands in recess. Thank you.